What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. The number one deck in the game is, to me, undeniable. Victoria Hand has everything you could possibly ask for in a metagame such as this. The release of Prowler has contracted the metagame a bit, a metagame that was already contracting to a point of Shadow King vulnerable decks are the biggest things that you can do in this metagame, is contracting further with the release of Prowler as people experiment with a bunch of mid-rangey move lists. In a world where people are playing either mid-rangey move lists, notably vulnerable to Shadow King, and also combo E decks that are vulnerable to Shadow King, the best thing you can do is be a Shadow King with minimal disruption mid-range deck that has a similar point output without that vulnerability. That is the role that Victoria Hand is filling in this list. I was going to start the tier list with Victoria Hand anyway, so I went and checked Untapped to see what the stats looked like in their sample, and frankly, they were truly ridiculous. Typically, the larger a sample size a deck has, the worse the win rate gets, because obviously more people playing it means not only the good players are playing it, and that also means that there are going to be matchups where, oh, this is so common that people are kind of used to it. They're teching against it. In top 10% in the last 7 days, this deck has more than 600 games played, and is still maintaining a 60% win rate. That is one of the highest marks I've ever seen with that kind of sample. It reminds me, honestly, of the anti-Venom decks, or the Agent Venom decks, when that came out, and it was just like, this is clearly the best thing to be doing, and I don't even know if I would ever change a single card in this. And that's how I feel about this list right now. This is so clearly the best deck in the game that if you want to play any other mid-range deck, I feel like you actually have to justify it to yourself as, I prefer doing this, I will have more fun doing this, because I don't think you're going to win more than if you played this. Move is still obviously a very powerful deck, but people have started playing different versions of the package, largely in order to accommodate the newest card, Prowler. My personal supposition is that basically all of that is worse than just playing typical Move. This is an extremely powerful deck. Let's just get that out of the way. It has the highest ceiling in the game with Human Torch multiplication. When you aren't doing Human Torch multiplication, you are doing Cosmo Juggernaut things. It is very difficult for your opponent to interact with you profitably because of the amount of ways you have to move all your stuff and then also have counterplay to their counterplay. That means that it is in rarefied air as a deck, and the one thing really holding it back is like, okay, you're a Madam Web deck. All right, good luck with that. I have a Deafening Chord for your Madam Web. Without the Madam Web, you have a lot less of this like guessing game, movable Cosmos stuff. Get Shadow Kinged. That's right, it's not the greatest V-hand matchup in the world, and generally speaking, the release of Prowler you'd think would be good because it takes a little heat off of this, but it has led to a bit of an uptick in Mercury, which is obviously not very good for this deck either. That said, it is still easily coming in at number 2 on the tier list. This list is a list that has been popularized and modified around a lot by Iris. It is a sort of new age mid-rangey deck, relying on a couple of the more recent additions to Marvel Snap to get different outputs or arrive at a point we were at a few months ago. What this deck is trying to replicate largely is the power of, hey, you remember when we had 3-cost Juggernaut and 3-cost Negasonic? We don't have that now, but we can get some free energy, a lot of redistribution of power on the final turn, and a shocking amount of interaction thanks to all of the stuff that we have here. We also have a couple of really great stat sticks. Both the Hydra Stomper and Spider Punk are phenomenally powerful at just being a good 3. Hydra Stomper much better late, Spider Punk much better earlier. We have Spider Punk alongside Aranya, we have Spider Punk alongside Madam Web. there are gonna be a lot of stats that this Spider-Punk guy can get to, and when I think of this deck, I think of it as like sort of the first Spider-Punk deck that is a Spider-Punk deck, as opposed to being, I am playing Spider-Punk in the move deck in order for it to be bad Human Torch. This is a deck that wants to play Spider-Punk, and that is unique about it. What it does is pair a ton of power with a ton of interaction. It's not a combo level of power, but it's a very reasonable mid-range level of power. And that interaction is there to prevent your opponents from doing whatever it is that they're going to do to beat you. For example, you're playing against Cerebro. You are the only mid-range deck on Earth that can actually handle that, thanks to Thing First Steps. You have Juggernaut, you have Cosmo. All of these combo disruptors are available to you. You have a Cosmo that can move with Madam Web, which is one of the most disgusting things on Earth. You have power that comes from moving your cards. And you have Negasonic, which is uniquely a pretty good card against Victoria Hand, a deck that is very prone to filling up 3 spots in a location and losing to a Negasonic. Powerful deck, very difficult to play. Let's jump in to the Prowler sector of the metagame. Now, there are a bunch of decks that are all about some Prowler. When I did my Prowler video, I described him as sort of the king of tier 2, and I think that's basically still where he's at. All of these decks, to me, need a coherent justification for why I would play them versus why I would play Victoria Hand instead. And largely, whenever I stack them up in this current metagame, I come down on the side of I would much rather be the Victoria Hand deck with Shadow King and Deafening Chord than I would be this kind of deck right now. And that's not anyone's fault. It's just that outside of Hydra Stomper, all of the power this deck does loses to a Shadow King too. So you're almost in the same space as a Zombies deck, where it's like, all right, you know, I'm mid-ranging really hard. I'm doing a lot of really awesome points. All my stuff is efficient. I've got Cosmic Ghost Rider. I've got good interaction. I'm doing cool stuff. But they're doing the same amount of points as you, and they have a Shadow King that beats at least one of your lanes. And so you just sort of sit there and you're like, wait a minute, why am I playing the mid-range deck that loses the mid-range matchup? And that's largely the problem that every Prowler deck has right now, is because they are so green power centric, they are not good Shadow King decks. Because they are not good Shadow King decks, they get out mid-ranged by the Shadow King decks. And that means that these decks are, yeah, they're the kings of tier 2. I don't want to sit here and act like these decks are not playable by any means. These are extremely strong decks. It's just there is something in their direct niche that is slightly but noticeably out-competing them at this time. But they're still really good. Like, that's the thing about calling something tier 2. I think people interpret it in different ways. Some people interpret it as like, I would never play this. Some people interpret it as like, this is totally viable. And I mean it much more in the second context here. These are extremely viable decks. This is, of course, a very solid points package that does a lot of cool stuff. There is absolutely nothing wrong with playing one of these decks unless you are really grinding out for that extra 2% equity that a different mid-range deck might get you. Zombies and Prowler have fused to become the most tier 2 deck of all time. We've combined a tier 2 deck with a tier 2 deck, and we've arrived at a deck that has all the same problems and no different solutions, but it is really cool and really fun. Like, it's hard because there's a ton of power here, right? Merlin Werewolf, ridiculous. One of the things that you'll run into with this deck, though, and I felt this pretty strongly, was it feels like it's trying to do a little bit too much. And there are a lot of conflicts in terms of what should I be playing on 3? How do I set this up? What am I allowed to do if I want to be a Zombies deck like this? And I think there's going to be some hard choices forced on the Zombies archetype in the near future, but it gets to avoid having to make those hard choices until the macro metagame stuff really shifts back in its favor. Because it's not necessarily worth making those hard choices when, if you're willing to make those hard choices, you're probably just playing V-hand anyway. What you can do is like try to optimize this a little bit, but you'll still have the same sort of fundamental macro issues that every zombie deck has, Shadow King, and that is kind of a thing that doesn't necessarily stand in its way, but maybe prevents the archetype from evolving a little bit because there's just not enough incentive to really go for it. Side note, I got this list from a player in my Discord named JDeg, and I think it's like a solid move in not necessarily the right direction for like zombie Prowler stuff, but it is willing to make the sacrifices that I think the previous deck list kind of needs to make in order to become a more efficient, more low to the ground kind of deck. I think the biggest question for a version of the deck like this is, what are my major advantages over being an Iris deck? Are they worth having? Do I like being a Merlin Werewolf deck? Would I prefer to be a Juggernaut Cosmo deck? What am I gaining out of being this kind of deck versus the Iris deck? Would it be better if I had, Thing First Steps and Hydra Stomper as my points package, and that way was less vulnerable to Shadow King? Like, all of that stuff is still up in the air, but I do think that fundamentally from a deck building perspective, this is a much more streamlined and stripped down version of the list. Granted, it does include a little bit more air, but it is a streamlined, stripped down version of the list that should be a lot easier to play. Because of what you could reasonably describe as Prowler mania, there's a lot of stuff moving around. A lot of Sam Wilsons, a lot of things going a lot of places on the board. Ika put this list together, and I, for one, am such a sucker for when you get to play Killmonger Uncle Ben in Scream decks. But I think the real top-line message here is actually Scream is a tech card, and I think maybe if you would like to beat the people who are doing all of this Prowler move stuff, small ball stuff, maybe just put Scream in your Prowler move deck. I do think this is a cool little deck that does some really interesting stuff. I like that it is able to do what it is able to do here, but I am a little bit unsure that you necessarily want to be doing this explicitly outside of the context of, boy, there's a lot of other people playing movie mid-range decks, and I would like Scream to instantly solo them. The Ika Hawk list is a great example of sort of Prowler's floor. If you're playing a Werewolf by Night deck, you're probably putting Prowler in it, and it probably makes the deck better. This is this is exactly the middle of tier 2 for me. I realize it's kind of ridiculous to be like tier 1, tier 2, high tier 2, mid tier 2. This is like exactly the middle of like, you can play this deck and not be embarrassed, I think. Like when you this is just a good solid deck that is a reasonable representative of its archetype. There are probably things that are doing generally its space better, but I think if you specifically want to be playing, if I want to be playing the best rock deck, this is probably the best rock deck, and that's a meaningful thing to say. One interesting dynamic that has developed is that there are a lot of mid-range decks, and 0% of them have the ability to play a Stardust right now. Hela is really good into all of this stuff. Now, you might notice the weird Mercury. I got that from Denish. I think it makes a lot of sense because, yeah, it turns out that the entire metagame is just either mid-range or a move combo deck that goes over the top of you. And half the mid-range decks are also move decks. So one way to get really free wins is to queue up against someone, see them playing Sam Wilson Craven, play Mercury, and then do Hela stuff. It's pretty impossible to lose from that situation. You just kind of can't do it. And that is enough of your matchups that you get to just be sort of snapping with impunity. Is it the world's greatest thing that Hela has to run tech to be good? No, but also it is the rare combo deck that doesn't get crushed by Shadow King, and it is also the rare combo deck that actually can tech against the combo decks that go taller than it right now because of the way the metagame has contracted. I think this is a genuine sleeper pick and could do really well for you on the final days of this season. The superior PEEF list is still a difficult to play, one of the most difficult to play decks in the game that is rewarding when you build up to it. This is a combo deck that sees the preponderance of Shadow King and says, look, okay, that's fine. You can win one lane with your Shadow King. I'm going to have things in all 3 lanes that are going to be bigger than your lanes. And that's what this deck is really trying to do. The typical gameplay loop involves a Fire Hair on 2 and then repeating various forms of on reveals as you see fit, whether that be Zombie Giant Man or the idea is basically Zombie Giant Man, Sage, and Cassandra Nova. When there's a Sage in here, you can replace the Cassandra Nova with a Sage. The old version of this deck used to play Sage before the zombie package came in. And so the idea is basically I think you can see the class of cards I'm talking about. It's a card that gains power with its own on reveal. And your job is to make that on reveal happen a bunch of times with both reviving it and Fire Hair, and then create like sort of exponentially larger copies of the card. Imagine a deck that's basic game plan was, I am going to build my own cloning Vats Cassandra Nova. That's kind of the vibe here. That's what it's trying to do. I'm going to build a cloning Vats Zombie Giant Man. I'm going to do that. That's the thing this deck wants to do. And it is a very difficult deck to play. I'm currently trying to arrange a demo stream of myself and Jet messing around with it, because I think that'd be honestly pretty helpful to people. And I hope that people will enjoy that, and maybe we'll be able to cut it down into a video, get it onto YouTube as well, because it's a very difficult deck to play, but the power really is there. In a pretty mid-range centric meta, I think that trying to go over the top in ways that are not typically being interacted with powerfully can be a really strong thing to do, which means that I think the Pixie Chef build is a very reasonable pull in this metagame right now. There are lots of things that you can do that are extremely powerful in this context, and I think that this deck has a ton of power output that is very, very real and very, very turn 6-y, and has suddenly become incredibly underplayed, despite, frankly, I think the metagame shifting to make it even more favorable because of all of these decks that are now doing Prowler-y mid-range stuff that you genuinely just get to crush when you combo off. It is very much like Mr. Negative, only you have a little bit more of an ability to win normal games. Speaking of Mr. Negative, I think it's playable in much the same way. I've seen various versions of Negative running around with like Shang-Chi for the move matchup or Shadow King for the move matchup. To me, unless you are a negative one trick, if you're doing that, you'd be better off just playing a different deck, which is largely to say that if Negative's premise of I am the biggest guy around is not happening, that's a really big problem, because so much of the deck is wrapped up in I am going to make this combo and I am going to be the biggest guy around. If you are in a situation where you have to be teching for wins after you combo off, I think that is a fundamental invalidation of whether or not this would be a good decision to play over other versions of this kind of thing. I still think Mr. Negative is a very playable deck, in large part because of how mid-rangey the metagame is getting. We are getting pretty low to the ground. Like, we've gone from a pretty combo-centric meta to one that is relatively lower to the ground. Like, yes, all the mid-range decks are synergy decks. Yes, they are still stronger than just playing good cards. No, we're probably not going to be able to bring Wiccan back anytime soon. But it is lower to the ground than it has been in recent months. I can say that pretty concisely. It's also a little bit more contracted than it has been in recent months. And those tend to be good spaces for decks like this to succeed. And I think the more people start playing, let's say, the hand and the move mid-range stuff, and less start playing Human Torch, the better off this deck is. And the smaller the overall point total in the game is, the happier Mr. Negative is to just farm people. Another deck I think is underrated in the context of a bunch of mid-range decks popping up. This is Cerebro 3, and it is kind of the only deck that gets to play a Mobius right now. That's a pretty cool thing to do. There are no other decks playing Mobius and Cosmo. There just aren't anything else. And, you know, Cerebro 3 is what it is. It's a very known quantity of a deck right now, but I think it is pretty underrated still, because it can do a lot of points and beat up all these mid-range decks. And you see people like when you look at like the Scream deck, right? Or the Darkhawk deck, they have nothing for you. The Scream deck has, we're going to try and maybe Lady Deathstrike you, and only in that specific build. And other than that, nothing. You have a Cosmo there, none of it works, right? Oh, you look at the other decks. Oh, okay, I got a Cosmic Ghost Rider. I've got a Cosmo. It doesn't work. Sorry. And so, like, this kind of deck where it can just bully snap every mid-range deck. Like, if you have Cerebro and a Cosmo in hand, and your opponent plays a Sam Wilson, you're probably just supposed to snap right then. It's that level of favored for you. Destroy is perhaps the most accessible and straightforward of the decks that currently exist in the context of, you know, I'm a new player, what do I play? Like, Destroy is a pretty solid rip. This deck is going to be in a lot of games. As always, the thing that holds it back is a lack of access to its own ceiling, which is to say, and I think I've tried to explain this concept before, but I'm going to really try to like get it in a visceral way this time. Destroy needs its doubler in its opening hand because Deadpool has a turnover turn requirement. Human Torch does not have to be in the opening hand, not just because it is more expensive and so you won't even be able to like be punished for not having it until turn 3, but because it can multiply multiple times per turn, meaning that you can play it as late as like turn 5 and still have like a banked Aranya, a banked Sparky, and get it to a very large amount of points if you want. That is not true of Deadpool. This deck does not have the ability to bank destroys with Deadpool the way that move does to bank moves with Human Torch. And so Deadpool needs to get out early. And if you aren't Deadpooling, then you're kind of stuck staring at a hand of like fairly mediocre stuff. And when you aren't Deadpooling, a lot of the premise of this deck kind of goes out the window. Like you have some good stats, you're competitive in the game because it's a game of Marvel Snap, and you can always get the reads right on the final turn of the game. But your opponent probably has a better idea of what your range is than you do of what their range is. And when you're going into a sort of reads game, that's a really big problem. This is Shem at home. It is basically there to be a little bit bigger than the mid-range decks. The typical way that games play out in other card games is you have your mid-range good stuff cards, ramp beats those, and then combo beats the ramp. And weirdly, that actually is kind of what's happening here. Ramp is beating the mid-range good stuff, and then combo will beat you if you're doing this. Like, you will lose to combo if they combo off on you. You need to be able to deal with what they're doing. This deck does points pretty well. It's as solid of an ethical ramp deck as we've ever had. It really can feel legitimately powerful. It's not the greatest thing in the world. It feels pretty solid, but like it's a very reasonable deck that I think is sort of the bottom of tier 2, where it's like, yeah, this is a deck. You'll see it, you'll play it. It does things. It has a functional role within the meta. I don't think anyone would ever call it the best deck in the game, but it's a reasonable choice. A bunch of stuff has gone wrong for Shem recently. And a lot of it is down to the increasingly synergistic point packages that make up mid-range decks have gotten better and better and better to the point that that triangle I described kind of breaks down a little bit at this point. Because if you're thinking about the average mid-range deck, a lot of them are going to have really good scalers. You are not beating the zombie package when it happens. You can, like, you have a Shadow King, right? Like, but you're Shem. If you don't have that, you're not going to beat it. You are not beating a Craven Sam Wilson Batroc opener. They just are going to have more points than you that game. And that is largely the thing that Shem struggles with, is that this is a deck that has a ton of cool stuff available to it. But if it's not beating the combo decks by nature of it, like you'll lose to C3, you'll probably lose to move. It needs to be beating the mid-range decks, and that's actually not as likely a proposition as you might think anymore, because the floor of mid-range deck output is so much higher than it was when people were playing like Wiccan copycat stuff. It's pretty hard to keep up. My most recent excuse to play AV is, of course, this ongoing list. I particularly enjoy it. It's a very me kind of list, but I'm not going to sit here and try to trick you into thinking that it's like the best deck in the game or anything like that. It's a solid choice. I think it's roughly equivalent to like the ramp list. There are good things going for it, and there are things going against it, like the preponderance of tech leaning itself towards Deafening Chord and Cosmic Ghost Rider. Not great for a deck like this. This is a deck that really wants to play in metagames where like the dominant tech cards are Shadow King and Shang-Chi. We're not in one of those metagames. But I do think that's a very metagamey kind of thing. There's a lot of power here. This is a really legit deck, and it might not be the perfect time for it, but it is still solid. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.